All right, we are recording. This is the Gateway API meeting for July 26th. Hope I got that date right. And we've got a lot going on. Thanks to everyone for the activity on GitHub and elsewhere. Just getting feedback in on a lot of different issues and PRs that we currently have in flight. One of the things I wanted to highlight, I presented this at the SIG Network community meeting last week on Thursday. There's nothing in here that would be new to anyone who's been, well, I think almost nothing that's in here that would be new to anyone who's attending these meetings. But the one thing that I wanted to highlight is we are so far, and that we may miss this, but still trying to target a mid-August V1 Alpha 2 release. No, sorry, not release, ready for review. So this is a little bit different now that we're moving to this whole K8s.io API group. When we as a group decide that we're ready for V1 Alpha 2, we need to get this extra additional round of review. So our new timeline and dates are targeting that time. So not when we're actually releasing an API, but when we're handing it over to another set of reviewers to actually take a look and walk through this. And I reached out to some SIG Network reviewers who are listed as API reviewers in the community for SIG Network. And Andrew, Dan, Cal, and Tim have all agreed to block off some time to review our APIs. So I'm really excited to have all of them able to help us review this API. And I think that's a great mix. And of course, this is not meant to be an exclusive list of reviewers or anything. I just wanted to reach out to these people in particular and make sure we had their time and availability to review. So with that, I'm really excited about getting this additional set of eyes on our API. But first, we actually need to have an API that we feel is ready for that extra round of review. There's also a cap associated with this. I don't know how quickly that needs to move. This isn't really tied to any release cycle. This is mostly just to formalize that this was happening. It's kind of a unique process we're in. I talked with John from SIG-Arch just to make sure that this is the correct process and this is what was recommended. So yeah, this is where I've been going so far. If anyone wants to change timeline, goals, reviewers, etc., add additional reviewers, that would be great. But this is what I've been thinking of so far. The other bits, we have lots of other content to get through in this meeting, so don't want to spend too much time here. But if you're looking for a summary of things we've changed in V1 Alpha 2 so far, this is that. So it's just a really high level summary of things that we've changed and some that are still in progress. Like I have links out to GEPs, for example, route gateway attachment. But anyways, that's all I want to cover here. We've got lots more to get through. Any questions on this process?
Did you get any feedback from the rest of the SIG network about the changes?
Yeah, so I would say generally positive feedback. I don't think, I think most of the questions were about how release cycle would work, if we're going to eventually try and tie ourselves to Kubernetes releases, if we'll eventually try and get some kind of, consistent release schedule out instead of just when we're ready, it's ready kind of thing. And other things like that I don't have great answers for yet. And I don't know if anyone has recommendations, but yeah, I don't think there was much feedback for the API itself yet, but I'm hopeful that as these reviewers start taking a look, we'll get more. So yeah.
Yeah, cool, awesome, thanks.
Cool. Yeah. All right, let's keep on going there. And on that note, you probably saw that that PR get in earlier today, last week, whatever. Welcome, Nick. So glad to have you officially as a maintainer. I think we all just kind of assumed you were already officially a maintainer, but glad to make that formality true. Really excited to have you on board. And yeah, thanks for all your contributions already.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate it.
Cool. Awesome. Well, so there's been so much discussion on GitHub, elsewhere, on different PRs, especially today, that I probably lost some of them. So if anyone wants to make sure a PR or issue is discussed here, I was thinking of leaving at least 15 minutes at the end for PR and issue triage. But if that's not enough time, I can try and time box these gaps to smaller chunks. Does anyone want to reserve more time for specific PRs or issues we've been discussing?
I think 15 minutes is reasonable.
Cool. All right. I'll keep on running with that then. Let's aim to have this specific conversation done in 17 or so minutes. So that would be 27 after the hour for me. So this is GEP 724, and it has had fairly minimal discussion. I probably didn't give the strongest introduction possible for this. And I also recognize that this may have come out of left field. So I think as I've been thinking about this GEP more, my rationale was to try to boil this down to the smallest and simplest possible way to connect routes and gateways. We can obviously add more, but as we're talking about moving to V1 Alpha 2, what V1 Alpha 2 represents to me is something we can always add to, but something that will be very difficult to remove from. Not impossible, but it's always easier to add than remove. And so we have a lot of possibilities right now in route gateway binding. Some of the defaults are maybe a little bit too permissive or open and not as secure as we'd like. And the variety of different ways you can connect gateways and routes can lead to some confusion. Those variety of factors, I think, are part of what led me to this proposal recommendation. But I'm very open to other approaches and feedback here. With that said, I want to open up discussion. If anyone's had time to read this over, take a look, any high-level thoughts on what's being proposed here?
I haven't had much a chance to have a look yet. We actually, off the back of the Kubernetes CVE, we actually had a contour CVE last week, which took all of my time.
That makes sense. Yeah, no, I know it's a busy time for many. I'll just run through just the very high level ideas here, and that's just that the idea is instead of having multiple ways, we're basically narrowing down the connection possibilities from several to one. And that means that route directly references the gateway or gateways it wants to attach to. And it removes specifically the selector from gateway to route. That's it. So you can imagine that if you remove the route selector from gateways and just condense the route to gateway option into from list, you end up with what I'm proposing here. I think this is essentially the simplest we can make this while still preserving the core functionality and still allowing us to expand back out into this mode if we ever need to or want to. I'm not convinced that we need the level of complexity we currently have in the API. But that's the high level approach here. I recognize it could take some time to think through this, but off the top of anyone's head, or any hesitation
Rob, I
or
think we should mention, is it in that doc that we did have some feedback from users that motivated some of this. I don't know
Yeah,
if that's clear.
yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. It was one of the goals. Unfortunately, I think this is feedback we got internally for GKE's implementation of Gateway API. So I don't know that we have any OSS feedback saying this, but that's something that we have gotten ourselves. I don't know if anyone else, any other active implementation out there has gotten any kind of similar feedback. But the feedback we've gotten both from initial usage and also from the first round of UXR that Mark has done has been that users prefer being very explicit about which gateways they want their route to be attached to.
Yeah, I think like we heard, I know that we entertained all these interesting ways to compose in between the gateway owner and the route owner that didn't require coordination, but everyone we talked to just, that didn't seem like an actual use case they cared about.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I really like the idea of that kind of seamless gateway replacement. As a gateway admin, you can just spin up a new gateway, but then when we tried to sell that to users and UXR, it was, well, okay, but it wasn't a very exciting capability, at least to the people we've talked to so far. Instead, they would rather have that very direct and clear reference.
Yeah, I guess it does seem like probably as an app owner, you probably can't see any pluses but only minuses for someone being able to change out the routing infrastructure that underlies the connections to you without you knowing about it. So I can kind of see where they're coming from. I think that it's something that probably your sort of cluster operator / gateway owner is going to be more interested in. But I think you've got, I do remember now, I did have a bit of a look at this. I think you've got, so the reference right now is a named gateway only, right?
Yeah.
The reference from the, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, like if we did decide to expand that and change that to a selector on the route for gateways, like a label selector or something like that, then you could still pretty easily replicate this, right? Like you could say, hey, make sure that your route is allowed to bind to these gateways, like to the gateways by selector. Then you could do that, or you could just say, hey, add this gateway into your route, please, and then you'll have two ways in. And when we confirm that the new way is good, then you can remove the old one, or something like
exactly. And
there are migration possibilities. It's just that they will require a little bit more. There will be a little bit less magic, but I kind of feel like operationally, people, like a lot of the time, less magic is actually good. Like you don't want your operational procedures to be too magic, because you want people in the loop at each step to be like, yes, this is working, we should keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I want to highlight here, is that I don't think of this as a really new set of functionality so much as it's removing existing functionality, which seems maybe even scarier. But what it does is it really simplifies what is capable, what is possible right now, and it leaves the door open. If we need to, we can go back to this more complicated way if that's something that we determine is really valuable to a set of users. It's very possible to go back to this more complicated way. What we can't do is, let's say we launch V1 Alpha 2 as it is right now with all these complex ways of connecting the two things. We can't pull things out later, or it would be very difficult. So my argument is to simplify now while we're seeing confusion and we think we have what is a simpler way for most people. And if we need those more advanced capabilities, we can add them later. James, I see a hand, or Harry.
Yeah,
Hey,
so
Rob.
go ahead.
Go ahead. Do you want to go first, Harry?
Yeah, let me go ahead. Rob, have you considered mesh use cases here? Because this could possibly be more challenging for the mesh implementations.
So I actually, yes. And so I was actually thinking this would help, but I could be wrong here. One of the things that this does, and I think there's many ways to accomplish this idea, but it enables a route parent that is not necessarily a gateway. So that route parent could be a route in route inclusion. It could be a custom gateway resource. Who knows? I don't know of any use case for that, but who knows? Or it could be some kind of resource that represents a mesh. Again, these are fairly undefined right now, but that's how I imagined this connecting to mesh. Does that make sense for your use case?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So then routes would, let's say you have a virtual resource, routes bind to that, and then your listeners forward to that virtual resource.
Yeah, that's one way of describing it. And there's not as much consistency in terms of mesh and how meshes are represented, but so I don't know that there's the same argument that we can have a standardized representation of a mesh, but yeah, that's how I had imagined it. So if we go down to this attached to, you basically just have this group kind name, and you can attach to an arbitrary kind of parent. That's all. That may or may not make sense. But I think it gives a little bit more flexibility than the current relationship, which has this type. It has a clear requirement that the parent of a route has to be a gateway, which I think we're moving further and further away from. So as part of V1 Alpha 2, I think we need to disconnect from that at a minimum. And we need to say that a route can be parented by something that isn't a gateway.
I see. Okay. That helps me. James, you can go ahead
Okay.
next.
Hey, Rob. So
Yeah.
I did a quick scan of this, and I think the semantics of this are not super clear to me. So if a route does an attach to, say if you have a gateway, and the gateway doesn't specify any selectors in its listeners. It has a listener, but the listeners don't have any selectors. And then you have a route which doesn't attach to the gateway. Is the route attached at that point or not?
Okay, so
My understanding, Rob, if I can, so just to see if I check if I've read this right, is that I think that currently it's that if it's in the same namespace, it works. And if it's across namespaces, you need the binding. Is that right, Rob? Or is it?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So the part that does not change there's a lot that already exists inside of Gateway. The only thing we're removing is the selector here, the route selector. So there's still the namespace component of same namespace is what I trust. So if the gateway trusts routes from the same namespace and the route attaches to it, you're great. Where you get that kind of room for confusion is if a route attaches to a gateway in another namespace, and that gateway has not allowed connections from routes in that namespace. That's I think where we enter that space for potential confusion. What I like about this approach is that it's very clear that intent was broken. So right now we have these kind of broad selectors, right? So a gateway selects all routes labeled foo in these three namespaces, and some app owner in another namespace creates another route labeled foo, and they're not selected by that gateway. And they may not, it's not clear, were they trying to attach to that gateway or not? Whereas here we have this very clear understanding of this user wanted to attach this gateway and it didn't work. And so we can describe that in status much clearer than we could some kind of arbitrary label selection mechanism.
Okay, so I think in terms of the way I think just technically in terms of the way this GEP is presented, I think we need to focus on like what is the semantic change, not like the change in syntax, like, because the semantic change is we're inverting the relationship about how you bind routes to gateways, right? And
Yeah, you could.
and that's a pretty substantial change to how we've been thinking about the API. So I think that needs to be like the number one thing that people would take away from reading this.
I would almost say that, and I think I should call that out more for sure. But I've seen numerous examples of users already using the API this way. So you can use the API this way in the sense that your route selector selects everything default, and you just use the from list for the route gateways thing in route. So like this functionality is very possible right now and already used. So it's more a question of how, but right, I should absolutely clarify that. But I don't, or go ahead.
Okay, so maybe this has been unclear all along, but my understanding of route gateways on the HTTP route was not that it binds a route to a gateway. It's that it's a permission for a gateway to bind it.
Yeah,
right?
That was the
So,
intent. That was absolutely the intent. And then we saw how people were using it, and it was not that. I mean, I'm sure in some cases it was, but in some cases, this was like a core use case of I want to list the gateways that I want to attach to, and this is a way to do it. You know, if you say gateway selects everything, then your routes are the ones that control what they attach to.
okay, so I guess that's the thing. My primary request about this gap is that we focus on like how does binding work, because it sounds like it sounds like it sounds like it hasn't been clear to people, and I think if we're clarifying and changing it here, then I think this gap needs to focus on like what is it going to be and make that absolutely clear.
Yeah, that's really good feedback. I can update that.
And I guess with that new perspective, I know Nick will add some color here to me, but I remember from Contour days, there were lots of people. Every now and then, people would want to get away from the restrictions of HTTP proxy inclusion. So the way Contour works is you have a top level, which then specifies what the next level is. So they wanted to break that top-down coupling, and I think this would generally let them do that, but I guess the cost is the other people who want the opposite direction.
Yeah, so I think that the thing that we've had on Contour is that Contour is a very strict, the sort of the top level HTTP proxy specifies the exact HTTP proxies to include, and then each one of those does the same. So it's a top-down only hierarchy. And what people wanted to be able to do is they wanted to be able to say, look, I don't want to have to edit the top level object in order to be able to attach new descendant objects to the top level object. And so I think this actually meets that same use case much better, in that it's the person who owns the one level down object who gets to choose which top level object they associate to. And so this kind of, and I think that you're right, James, that the big change about this is that it puts the control of the binding between a gateway and a route into the hands of the route owner, not the gateway owner. So the gateway owner has the ability to reject bindings and say only bindings from here are valid, but at the end of the day, it's the route owner who actually is the one who picks what gateway they want to attach to, and that is the big change here.
Yeah, and I think this also addresses the need that the Istio folks, John Howard, had, where they want to attach their existing virtual host resource type, as well as the gateway resource, HTTP route resource types. So they want to be able to attach multiple resource types to the same listener, and you could do that with this change. The security aspects that we previously worried about, I think, are can generally be addressed with the reference policy restrictions.
Yeah, so
So-
and I think the thing that I like about this one, sorry, Rob, I know you want to talk and I'll keep talking over you. Is the thing I like about this one is that one of the things that Rob has done here is he's actually kind of folded the same idea we have with reference policy into the gateway struct. So like the gateway does the same thing that the reference policy does for other objects. It's the thing that says, you know, only attachments from this set of namespaces and this kind of thing are valid. And I think that the exact way in which we define that is pretty important. I can't remember, Rob, exactly how you've defined that, but I think that, you know, as long as we specify, as long as the exact behavior is very specific, it's fine. Like, you know, one of the things that I was wondering about was whether people might want sort of more open defaults, like if you don't specify kind, it's all kinds, that sort of thing. But I think that one of the things that the stuff we've found in looking at cross namespace references is that a lot of this stuff, like, you're better off, like, in terms of security for your overall cluster, especially in a multi-tenant context, you're better off trading off wordiness in the actual object for clarity and explicit config, rather than having implicit things in there that can put you into a bad place where you've got more things exposed than you anticipated. Sorry, Rob, over to you.
No, that's great summary, and yeah, I agree. And I know I said I was going to time box this, so I think this has been a really good discussion. I'll make sure to update this gap soon with that feedback in mind. One thing that I'm realizing I haven't explained well in this gap, I don't think I have, is kind of my fundamental frustration with label selection, in that it's not a security mechanism, and it's, you know, when you're talking about crossing namespace boundaries, it's, again, the app owner had all the control in the world anyways. The app owner saw that, you know, routes of label foo were selected. They just label their route foo, and they're now attached to that gateway. Like, the idea that selection was happening from gateway to route, although that's what we documented, it still required the route owner to label their app in a specific way. So again, the route owner was the one with control. So the selection mechanism, in my mind, was something that added more confusion and no security at all. So I would rather remove it and describe what's actually happening very explicitly. So yeah, that was my thought here.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think Harry put a thing in the chat saying something like selectors are useless for security.
Yeah.
I 100% agree. I think that selectors give the illusion, like, make you feel like maybe there might be some security, but because of the issues around the label ownership being the same as object ownership, it's not a good idea to base any security things on labels.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. All right, well, this has been really good feedback. I'll make a note to update this, and I'll ping everyone when I have an update out. But yeah, thanks. The next gap I wanted to cover here real quick. This is one that I want to be clear is what I would say optional, nice to have, but not required for V1 Alpha 2. My motivation for this is purely just had some internal feature requests for this. It seemed somewhat straightforward. I know nothing is ever that straightforward when it comes to new APIs around this stuff, but I wanted to at least try for it. Now, I recognize that we may not get it in, but wanted to spend just a bit of time discussing it today, and then we can move to triage, and looks like around 12 minutes. This is really not trying to be a complete a complete enhancement. It's not trying to cover the entirety of redirects and rewrites, but it is trying to expand them just slightly. So what you may see already is that Harry already added host and protocol and port redirects. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I think those are the main concepts that are already checked in. Yeah. and what I'm proposing here is expanding that to include path redirects, and then we have no support at all for rewrites. So adding some concept of rewrites, and these concepts seem similar enough that they could be merged into a single gap. But feel free to correct me. I'm happy to split this out, whatever. The main idea here is, yet again, path redirects, and the most simple form of path rewrites that could be portable, and do it all in a way that we can build on this and add more advanced rewrite and redirect capabilities. Looks like I got an extra redirect in there. Cool. So just like redirects. With that said, I'm proposing starting with just plain path redirects, path prefix, and redirects and rewrites, and host rewrites. I spent some time running through a few APIs here, looking at Envoy, GCP, HA Proxy, Nginx. Feel free to add other implementations out there just to see what was possible. And my understanding, my translation of looking at these, what I saw was most portable was the idea of a prefix, rewrite, or redirect. And so that's what I proposed to start with. And I wanted to propose it in such a way that it was hopefully portable and easy to extend in the future. But with that, I see a hand. Nick, go ahead.
So I like the look of it. Just having a quick look through now. The thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that there is a very strong interaction with if we do include a route inclusion. What happens when you stack a prefix rewrite on an included route is so if you have a route that has a prefix rewrite and then you have another route that has a prefix rewrite that's included into the other route, like how do the features interact? For HTTP proxy, we had a very specific defined way of doing this, and that was that the including route sort of wrapped. You sort of, when you included a route, you got the prefix on any if you're rewriting or adding a prefix to the route, you got those, but that's not the only way to do it. But the key thing here is that I'm trying to point out is that there's a very strong interaction between messing with the route and route inclusion.
Rob, I have to look at this. There is a interesting implementation difference. I don't know if people remember Apache, but the rewrite actually rewrote the request and re-injected it versus just rewriting it when you send it upstream. That I thought was the significant difficulty. But I don't know if no one's implementing this for Apache, so, and I forget how Nginx behaves.
Yeah, there's a variety of, there's definitely nuance here, and good feedback from Nick as well about route inclusion. I had not thought about the overlap there, but definitely significant. And I would imagine any kind of rewrite on two levels is going to be very complicated to do well. I'll have to think about that a little bit. Harry, I see your hand. Let me get to you too while we're here.
Yeah. So so I think Bowie sort of mentioned this in passing. So redirects and rewrites are sort of two different functionalities. So sometimes rewrites themselves have more use, like broader use, and redirect being one of them. So have you considered like splitting these two into like these two separate filters? And
yeah, they are different filters. I am proposing. So yeah, to clarify, I do have the concept split up in the gap itself. So redirect, all I'm suggesting is adding actually this to the request redirect filter. But then because the structure of the request rewrite and redirect filter are so similar, I included them in the same gap, and the support and the means of how, looking at Envoy, anyway, there's some overlap in how they're actually configured. at least in other technologies.
I see. So the reason it's redirect is because you're not redirecting to a static location. You're redirecting to a location that's based on the location passed in.
So there's a path redirect. That's what I'm suggesting adding, but separate from that, I'm suggesting a request rewrite filter. Now, those. So I maybe I should not have combined these concepts together, but the structure of the filters will be very similar. That's all I'm trying to communicate.
Right, I see. Yeah, because they like do completely different things.
Right.
One of them
right.
sends a response back. The other one just
Yeah.
does rewrite basically.
Yeah, you're correct. So yeah, so looking at the ones that as an example, where it got into a little bit of confusion is that if you look at Envoy, for example, they have a configuration like prefix rewrite that is valid for either redirects or forwarding. Same with regex and a variety. So like there's just a little bit of overlap. Most other providers have separated these out. And this is still like you can rewrite in the context of a redirect is how Envoy allows configuration. And most people are better at Envoy than myself. So feel free to correct me on this, but that's my understanding of the reference doc. But you're right, these are separate concepts. It just seemed similar enough in terms of how they'd be configured. But I'm happy to split this out.
So this also gets into the order of filters.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. If you have the then the order of the filters really matters, because if you rewrite and then redirect, then you're going to end up with a different result. If you redirecting is a terminating option, is a terminating filter, right? Like you can't have another rewrite afterwards.
Yeah, I have considered, and this is again the lowest common denominator thing, but I have proposed that these filters would be unique. You could not use a redirect and rewrite filter on the same path on the same route rule. Sorry, that may be too limiting. I don't know. There were some providers. I'll have to look back through the list here, but I think some did not support both at the same time. Maybe that was just GCP though. I'm not sure if there were any others.
I feel like we could probably lift something like, again, this is an Envoy thing. I don't know how other proxies do it, but in a few of Envoy's ways in which you can specify a list of filters, some filters are marked as terminating filters and some filters are not terminating filters. And so a terminating filter is the last filter in a list. And if you put anything after terminating filter, it doesn't do anything. In this case, both of these ones that you're talking about would be terminating filters, terminating route filters.
Right.
If you put anything after them, then it's either invalid or it just doesn't do anything. Probably having it be invalid is better.
Now, a rewrite doesn't necessarily have to be a terminating filter, though. Like if you had some kind of
I think that's just good language to use, because it's then like it means I think that we've already talked a little bit about the ordering of filters, that it's a list, it's implicitly ordered, that's important, and then having a way to say this is a terminating filter seems to me to make sense, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, I know we're go ahead, Jeff, actually.
The only thing I was going to say is I actually agree that you're putting both of these into the same gap. They are so close, and I think the format should be, keeping them in the same gap, try to be consistent in the format between them. When they're such closely related, it doesn't make sense to separate them out. So.
Cool. That's good.
Yeah,
to
I
hear.
think it makes sense given the proximity in most of the implementations to keep it together.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll keep this together. It sounds like there's still a number of questions to be answered on this one, so I'll try and come back through here with a bit more detail as far as how these interact. I would come back to what I said at the start too, that this is a nice to have feature for V1 Alpha 2, but is
And it's
certainly not
additive, right?
Yeah, exactly. It is
So-
not necessary.
I see. Okay. And Rob, you said that you haven't specified whether or not these can both exist at the same time.
No, so what I have said right now is at most one of these may be
I
used.
see. So they're exclusive to each other.
Yeah, this may not be used
Okay.
at the same time as, so that's what I'm going with right now. I recognize that that is not required for all implementations. There are some that can support both rewrites and redirects at the same time. That would, imply that they understood ordering and that rewrite should occur before redirect, etc. So maybe this is a limitation we can remove, but then that removes some level of portability.
And then there is also the other filter. So what happens if you combine, I think, what's the name, request modifier filter with request redirect filter? Like, let's say I add a header or something like that, and then are those two
Yeah,
seen
or if you change the host header at the same time as you have a rewrite host, which there are some weird interactions possible between those two.
I mean, one way out could be like, up until this point, we have said that, filter ordering is something, implementation specific, and we don't get into specifics because we want more feedback, and then the API can be more prescriptive in future. So sticking to that could help us here as well.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Okay, well, yeah, this is really good feedback on this one. I will try to update this PR as well, but as much as I'd love to have it in, it is purely additive. It is something like we can add after V1 Alpha 2, and it will be fine. So I'll keep this one updated, but if you are in between looking at this PR and another PR, I'd recommend a PR that has a breaking change like the previous GEP we looked at. So cool. With that, I promised to leave some time for issue and PR triage. There's been a lot of discussion on a variety of issues and PRs. Let me just highlight a couple PRs before I get into issues. I think there's more larger discussions on issues. First, I want to highlight this one, which is an additive one that actually came from an issue. It is to implement method matching. This actually originally came from a Kubernetes upstream feature request, redirected them here saying this is probably a better way to add this feature. We had a tracking issue on this, and it has turned into an actual PR, which is great. There's been some good discussion and review on it. I think we're getting fairly close here, but I just wanted to give this opportunity. If anyone has a strong feeling about this one, this is a great one to talk about now or add comments on the PR. This is one that is not going, I don't think it's large enough to deserve a gap. But I just want to make sure we have some time to discuss it here because it is rather significant in that it's adding fields to the API or a field to the API.
I think most of it is straightforward. The only thing that I don't really worry about too much, but should be called out is custom HTTP methods are a thing, and this patch does not support it.
Yeah, that's a good one. And And there are, this is really just a convenience method. If we already have header matching, and well, again, depends on the implementation, but for implementations that support those pseudo headers like the colon method, yeah, that would be their way to do custom method matching, unless I'm missing any
What's the
nuance
state
here.
of that pseudo header thing? I'm trying to click through this.
I don't think we clarify that pseudo headers are allowed or disallowed.
Yeah, we don't
I
have
meant in
any guidance.
HTTP in general.
Well, it's a real thing in HTTP 2. It's not really a real thing in HTTP 1, I think, but like you could implement it, of course.
Yeah,
Like there's no literal colon method header in HTTP 1, but if someone put that as a header match, then you could say, oh, this is method, and I'm going to convert that to a method match because my implementation, doesn't have a method pseudo header or something. Like you can still implement it even if you don't have, if your proxy doesn't read these.
And if I'm remembering correctly, Envoy will read the method pseudo header and translate it to a method match in HTTP 1. Is that correct? That's what I remember from reading the Envoy stuff.
Yeah, Envoy like normalizes everything. So like even an HTTP request, you end up with like a pseudo headers for everything. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So it seems like this is not particularly controversial, but I just wanted to make sure it was highlighted. Still some review and feedback on here, but I think it's good to get in once we have enough reviewers on board.
Is there any proxy that does not, or any implementation that does not support it, like method-based routing?
I'm sure there's one.
It's funny, pseudo headers are, if you read this RC, are not headers, HTTP headers. Anyways, that's just a funny note looking through the RC.
Yeah, I wasn't. So on that note, Harry, that's a good question. I was originally thinking this should be extended support, but then I looked at header matching, and I realized that we consider header matching core support. So if we consider header and I know it's not a complete overlap, like not everyone's going to support pseudo headers like this. So I don't know. I don't know what the appropriate support level is on this one.
I think Envoy just took a shortcut because technically speaking, pseudo headers are not actual headers. Like you can't just arbitrarily put them in any exchange. That's just specific to Envoy.
Yeah, I think it would be better to go from extended to core rather than the other way around. So here, because there could be somebody who doesn't support it, and this is not something that would be used widely. I mean, I can see very like theoretical good use cases of this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. A few other things I want to highlight in terms of PRs here. I have a few implementation PRs of existing gaps. One of them is removing backend policy, then the rest of the policy attachment gap. If anyone has extra cycles, there are gaps, notably the reference policy gap that has merged, and it's really just, all the spec is out there and it just needs to be translated into an actual PR. So those may not be too bad to implement if you're looking for a way to contribute. If anyone wants to volunteer, I would love it. But no worries on that one. So just ping me or assign yourself. Probably best would be to assign yourself to a gap issue if you want to actually implement it. Yeah. Well, I'm at the
message on Slack too if you're.
That's a good idea.
Help.
Yeah. While I'm looking through the PRs, are there any other ones that we should highlight here?
Can we do 730? That turned out to be controversial.
Oh, yes, you're right. Thank you. All right. So let's remember what the a one-line change, a significant one. So yeah, suggesting that a TLS route was a valid route when TLS mode is terminate. And there's a variety of conversation. I have not followed this as closely as I should have. John and Harry and James, anyone want to summarize this discussion?
Yeah, I can summarize it. So the idea here is they are suggesting that you can terminate TLS at the gateway and then still use a TLS route to match on the SNI header to do some routing. So what this does is allow the route owner to do SNI routing even when TLS is terminated, whereas before you kind of had to do it at the gateway level if you're terminating TLS. So some concerns with this is that it's kind of changing the semantics where before, and I will say this is my concerns that I'm summarizing. We kind of had 3 protocols involved. One was the downstream protocol, which is clearly defined by the listener protocol. And then we have the upstream protocol, which is clearly defined by APAC protocol. I think those are not controversial. But what we have today kind of is this route type, which is defining the protocol. So here we're kind of straying away from that, and we have this TLS route, even though inside the actual routing here, we've like already terminated it, so it's TCP. So with TLS and TCP, this looks fine at first glance, I think. But I think that's only because TLS is kind of a superset of TCP. But if we look at something like HTTP, then it gets a bit confusing. So if you scroll down like 2 lines, because I forget what I said here. Yeah, so like if we wanted to do something like terminate HTTPS traffic and then match on some HTTP property and the SNI, then we're in like this weird state where we're trying to do TLS matching and HTTP matching together. And so do we use a TLS route, but then we can't do HTTP? Do we use an HTTP route, but then we can't do TLS? But do we add all of the TLS properties into every route type? It gets very confusing. And it seems like if we just do this change without also addressing HTTP, then we somehow have more functionality for TCP than HTTP, which seems a bit backwards since HTTP is normally the core use case. So overall, I find it somewhat confusing to do this, especially when you consider HTTP.
So my take on that was or is like with HTTP route, we could be terminating HTTP. We terminate HTTP at the proxy or at the implementation, and then we use HTTP route. In that case, the listener protocol and the route type is same. And in this case, that's the same thing. We're terminating TLS at the gateway, and then we're doing some matching based on TLS metadata. So in that regard, it's the same thing. The only way, if you do not like, this was intended, like when initially TLS route was created, this was supported. So this is really a fix for that. But let's say if we do not add this feature in, then the only way a user can do TLS termination and then do routing based on SNI would be via gateway listeners. Or would there be any other way to do that?
Yeah, so I guess that was my impression as well. Like, I thought, my understanding was like, this has always been how it works. And that, so I kind of agree with John in that there's a little bit of smearing in terms of, you know, is the route the next hop protocol, or is it just the matching? And yeah, it arguably it's a little bit of both, but I think it's always been that the backend protocol and the service app protocol tells you whether to do TLS to the next hop. So I think the intention with TLS route was always that you would be able to terminate and not necessarily specify, and it doesn't necessarily require that you're doing TLS to the next hop because that's controlled by the app protocol.
Yeah, I think. So John, the situation you're trying to set up is that you do both kinds of routing. Is that right? You could do it with a delegation or inclusion proposal that needs to be written, but
Yeah, so I guess my thought is that I'm not like there's nothing fundamentally wrong with allowing this type of routing. Like it is obviously implementable and it obviously meets some real demands. I just don't feel like right now there's a cohesive story with HTTP. And there's certainly ways that it could be addressed. But I feel like we should address them before we do this, personally.
So is what you're saying, John, that that we need to be clear in the case of like using a HTTP route that whether or not SNI can be used as a discriminator?
Yeah, like why can we use TLS route for raw TCP traffic that's been terminated, but we can't use TLS properties in the HTTP route when we terminate HTTPS?
Right, right.
So specifically for the SNI name, you can. It's the host name.
Well, maybe. I don't know if that's been solidified yet.
I think that's the issue here is that we had. So I mean, I certainly anticipated that that's a thing you could do. That's how Contour works. That if you specify a host name for a HTTP route, then that is also expected to be used for the as the SNI, and it won't match unless they do match. That we do have an issue tracking it, Harry. Thanks. But yeah, so yeah. To ensure that SNI does not equal hostname, Harry? Like, is
there anything beyond the hostname? Like,
Yeah, I mean,
it's a fairly
well, I assume in
obscure
the future,
use case.
like TLS is not just going to be SNI. TLS route, is it just going to be SNI forever, or are we going to add other things like TLS version and I don't know, whatever other things people come up with?
Yeah,
some of this stuff, I think there's things you could match on, but like I'd be hesitant to kind of expose everything. I mean, clearly we could match on, sort of arbitrary TLS properties, but is there really a use case for like sending different TLS versions to different services? Or in that case, is what you want more to be able to specify constraints? You say, well, I only want to talk to you on TLS 1.2 or TLS 1.3.
Yeah, I think so. Harry, can you just clarify with that issue? So to ensure that SNI does not equal hostname for HTTP routes, is that right? Or
yeah, so we have discussed that. I think Nick, you have been the one to lead that conversation where we want to make sure that users cannot you cannot use one SNI and then to establish a TLS session and then use another host name. That's essentially a security problem as far as I know.
So yeah, so I think John, I guess the thing that we haven't done there is so I think it's probably the conflicting one. So if the SNI does not match the host header for a HTTP route, then you're doing like domain fronting. And if you do anything like authentication or authorization or something like that at the gateway level, then you can use the domain fronting to swing around those things. So it's a security problem. So I think in general, we should, unless people really know what they're opting into, most of the time you don't want to do domain fronting, and we shouldn't allow that unless without people having to jump through significant hoops to indicate that they understand the security risks.
Yeah, I mean, there's other cases too where it's not just like having a completely different domain, but you have, say, SNI match on anything, and you do the matching and the routing, or you have like star.example.com, but your route's foo.example.com.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely worth us being very specific about for a HTTP route match, like for a listener that specifies HTTP or HTTPS or TLS and that has HTTP routes behind it, like what do the host name fields do and what are you allowed to do and how do wildcard host names play into that? Because that is something that is relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like we're at time, but like I think this is a case where we should make sure that the secure thing is the easy thing. I don't,
Agreed.
of course, there's like use cases we can enable them, but they should be hard to set up. Like it's okay for that to be hard to set up because they're kind
So
of
that's
obscure.
that's why I wanted to make it that, you know, SNI and hostname have to match in some way. I mean, we could use the same label matching wildcard matching semantics we use for like hostname at gateway and hostname on route. With, you know, you can have a single wildcard label as the first label and some other stuff like that. So I think that like one of us just needs to sit down and write down what those rules are and say, okay, this is the rules for, these rules apply for if you're doing TLS and using SNI for routing, then it has to match in this way. You know, I think that I feel like there's definitely an implicit assumption right now that if you're doing it, you are using the SNI. If you're terminating HTTPS for a HTTP route, then you are using the SNI. You are checking the SNI. There's definitely an implicit assumption that you are doing that, but that is not called out anyway, and we should do that. Does that seem fair, John? Would that clarify?
I think like we
previous...
need to figure out where those exceptions and how we're going to represent it potentially. But yeah, the default, it should be that you have to kind of make them line up.
I feel like we kick that down the road and say, if you want exceptions, ask, and then we'll figure out how to do it later.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I don't feel like we should tie the API in knots to maybe be able to do that for something.
No, yeah, that's basically kind of the bottom line, is that make the standard stuff secure.
Yeah. So yeah, John, I guess the question I had for you is if we clarified those rules in the HTTP route sort of guidance somewhere, do you feel like that would remove some of the fuzziness around the SNI stuff for the other case?
Yeah, so I guess if we only have SNI matching, then this starts to make more sense, because then yes, HTTP is just escapable because you're already doing the SNI match implicitly with hostname. So that makes more sense there. If we add other stuff, which I agree seems kind of obscure, and we could get every feature request in the world in Istio pretty much, and I've never heard anyone ask to match on TLS version or Cypher suites or anything like that. So I don't even think Envoy supports it. So this seems like there's no demand from anyone really, that I've heard at least. So it seems plausible that we'll just have SNI. One thing we may want to consider, and this is not fleshed out idea, but we have in other discussions talked about adding hostname to TCP route. If we already have this HTTP hostname means both the HTTP host and the SNI host when it's used in a TLS context, we could possibly do the same thing with TCP route. So you would do the exact same thing they're doing here, but TCP route instead of TLS route.
Yeah.
That's off the top of my head, so maybe it doesn't make sense, but we could think about it more.
I think that comes back to the thing that I put in the channel, though, that like in my mind, it's kind of expected that if you're doing like TCP route kind of implies like a port to port, like you're forwarding, like you're not inspecting the traffic, you're just taking what's in the port, goes straight to the back end service, and your only discriminator is like port and other like layer 3/layer 4 stuff. But then TLS route allows you to use TLS stuff as a routing discriminator.
Yeah, but even today, like there's almost two layers. There's one is the TLS layer, and then after you've terminated TLS, what do you do? And even today, like you can have TCP route that's terminated by TLS, right? You just can't actually match on the SNI.
Yeah, yes, that's true. Yeah. So but it would be.
But you can't wait. You can match on the you can match on the SNI by having multiple listeners.
Yeah, yes, but not in like your TCP route.
Sure.
Yeah,
like
I guess if
you in that diagram I had with the 3 protocols, I think I may have been misunderstood, but the way I saw it was kind of that the middle protocol is what is the route, and that is the protocol after TLS termination, if any. So like in the TLS case, that would be a TCP route because it would be terminated to the TLS. And then I guess if we added hostname there, then the hostname would control SNI. I don't know. It may be a bit more confusing than just doing TLS route, but it would be consistent with HTTP route in some way.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think that's the thing where HTTP route kind of breaks the mold, is that
I think, yeah,
the route type isn't really the protocol.
yeah, like it's not like standard protocol processing where you just kind of toss the previous one, because inside that green box, actually it knows more than just like, let's say you were running some TLS termination thing and then it handed it off to you. Like there's actually some coupling between the two
So you're saying
that
OSI
can be
model is
used.
broken.
Unfortunately, the modeling is not very precise.
Yeah, so that's why you are saying OSI model is broken.
Well, yeah, I think
I mean,
OSI
it
model,
is, right? 'Cause-
OSI model doesn't handle TLS, right, at all. It doesn't. TLS does not fit into the OSI model at all.
Yeah, I mean, it was meant as a
Like the
joke.
whole point of the quick protocol is to kind of blow through all the.
Yeah.
And I guess one question I have, which we're way over time, but if we add hostname to TCP route, do we even need TLS route at all? Because like,
Yeah, like if we add, I think
does
if
it
we add
do?
a TCP route, then that means that TCP route is by default a TLS route, because the only way you can discriminate between TCP routes is to use TLS, because otherwise, like that in that case, like the TCP route would only be a valid target if TLS has been set up at the thing. If you've got a TCP route with a host name and there's no TLS at the gateway, like on the listener, then it's not a valid config, right? Like you can't discriminate. You have no way to retrieve the host name for a TCP route for a pure TCP connection. And that's the thing that, in my mind, that's the thing that separates a TLS route from a TCP route. Is a TLS route, maybe it's HTTP, maybe it's not, maybe you're forwarding, maybe you're terminating. But the thing that is the thing that you are allowing the controller that implements the gateway to have to multiplex multiple TLS routes into a single port at the end of the day. For a TCP route, it implies that you can't multiplex TCP routes onto a port. There's no way in which you can multiplex TCP routes onto a port, or possibly aside from source IP, from like other things in the tuple, but you can't do it on destination information because there's not enough metadata available to a TCP or UDP route connection. And I think adding the hostname then into TCP route and UDP route, as James says, it obviates the need for TLS route. Like there's no discriminator. And in my mind, that's why I posted that thing in the channel, was that, like, in my mind, those are the differences between the different things, is what is used as the routing discriminator if you are sharing, having multiple routes specified in the thing. Yes, and we are super over time. But I think this one is definitely worth talking more about because it's pretty fundamental to the to what each object is for. And that's one of the things that we really need to be more specific about, is what is each one of these objects for? What is the intended usage of this object? And that should be like top of the doc string, is like TLS route is intended for use to blah 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 blah. And that's so that we explicitly state what the intention is, rather than people having to impute it by figuring out and looking at the spec.
Yeah, this is a really good discussion. I do want to time box this because we are way over time, but I think conversation in chat too from Bowie about TCP and UDP route and host names and where that discussion is, because we've had that discussion. Thank you everyone who's been involved there, but we haven't had that discussion in the context of what you've been saying, what everyone's been saying now, of the overlap between TLS route and TCP route, if host names were to filter down there. And this is exactly the kind of conversation we should be prioritizing with V1 Alpha 2 around the corner, because we don't want to ship something to V1 Alpha 2 if we don't want it to exist beyond V1 Alpha 2. So if there's any thought that we should, include TLS functionality in TCP route and drop TLS route, we should explore that fully now. So yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on this, and I think great points have been raised, but I think we should continue this discussion either on this issue or on the originating issue for this discussion, which was actually a PR. So maybe we should continue this discussion on 727. since this feels a bit closer.
I think it's really important though that this is not obvious, and it's not obvious to people who've been involved in the project for a long time. And I think the fact that we're having the discussion means we need to kind of do better somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, thank you so much for staying longer today. This is a great discussion. Encourage everyone to continue and follow up on this. Let's aim for continuing discussion on 727, and we can go from there. But thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.